you be that guy one last time for us. I'm not playing. This is my life. Hey.
This story begins with Dan, a top salesman at a used car dealership in Buffalo, New York. Known for his skill in selling cars, Dan has built a reputation as the best salesman around. One day, his boss asks him to take a photo for the company website, but Dan declines because he wants to celebrate his wedding anniversary with his wife, Jessica. Dan is a responsible, hardworking man who organizes his life down to a schedule he keeps at home. When he arrives home, he greets Jessica and their 3 kids, Nina, Kyle, and Max. Jessica and Nina are having a disagreement over Nina's college plans. Nina had originally aimed to study journalism at Stanford University, but now she wants to attend Southern Iowa University to be closer to her boyfriend, Trevor. Jessica asks Dan to speak with Nina, but Nina remains firm in her decision. Later, Dan looks forward to taking Jessica out for their 18th wedding anniversary and asks Kyle to watch over Max. Kyle, however, has other plans and refuses, passing the responsibility to his older sister, Nina, who isn't thrilled but eventually feels better when she thinks about going to the same college as Trevor. Meanwhile, Kyle meets up with his friend Samir, only to discover that instead of working on group assignments, they end up playing video games in Samir's garage after Kyle pays him some cash. Online, Kyle is actually quite popular, going by the username Killboy and enjoying a loyal fan base. That evening, Dan and Jessica head to an amusement park to celebrate. Jessica is a bit frustrated with Dan's tendency to stick to routine, and she suggests they take the family on an out-of-town trip. After riding a few attractions, Dan promises he'll plan a family vacation soon. Jessica is delighted by the idea, and as they share a kiss, a group of teenagers nearby snaps photos and starts teasing them. Dan calmly approaches the teens and politely asks them to delete the photos. But just as they're about to comply, one teen accidentally spills his drink on Dan. Instead of reacting aggressively, Dan simply chooses to walk away, diffusing the situation with grace. The following day, Jessica was at the gym practicing boxing to blow off some steam. As a stay-at-home mom, she often felt frustrated by the challenges she faced, especially when it came to giving advice to her daughter, Nina. While she was boxing, she accidentally punched another woman, Gwen, who was also training nearby. Embarrassed, Jessica quickly apologized, explaining that she was venting her frustrations because her husband never took the family on vacations or spent quality time with them outside the home. After they talked for a while, Gwen mentioned she had to head to the airport for her job as a tour guide. Before leaving, Gwen handed Jessica her business card, offering to help if Jessica ever wanted to plan a getaway. Meanwhile, Dan was at the supermarket shopping with Max when a stranger suddenly attacked him. Reacting swiftly, Dan defended himself, shocking everyone around with his fighting skills. After the scuffle, Dan calmly paid for his groceries and returned home, where he opened a hidden drawer under the stairs containing weapons. Concerned about the unexpected attack, he called his friend Augie, asking him to arrange new identities for himself and his family. Later, Dan took Max to Nina's school. He stopped by the school magazine editor's office, expecting to find Nina there, but she wasn't around. A student then informed him that Nina had left the magazine club 3 months earlier and was now hanging out with friends under the stadium. Dan found Nina there and expressed his disappointment that she hadn't told him about quitting the magazine. Frustrated, Nina revealed she'd left because her dad had never bothered to read any of her articles. Dan, realizing how she felt, asked her to come with him. They then went to pick up Kyle from his chess class, but Dan discovered that Kyle was actually playing video games at his friend Samir's garage instead. Dan reprimanded Kyle and told him to get in the car. Once all the kids were in the car, Dan drove to pick up Jessica from her job at the hospital. To everyone's surprise, he announced that they were going on a family trip to Las Vegas, just as Jessica had always dreamed of. Meanwhile, a black van was secretly tailing Dan and his family. When Dan noticed the van following closely, he didn't alert his family, but quickly thought of a way to lose the followers. Keeping his family unaware, he sped up and drove skillfully through traffic, eventually heading to his workplace's car dealership. There, he parked the car and lifted it on the mechanic's hoist, only to find a hidden listening device attached underneath. Dan carefully removed the device and attached it to a car that his coworker was about to test drive. Acting casually, He then suggested his coworker take the car out at top speed to check for any issues. The people in the black van, still monitoring the listening device, fell for the trick and followed Dan's coworker instead, thinking it was Dan. Once he was sure it was safe, Dan returned to his car and resumed the family's road trip to Las Vegas. But before they got too far, Jessica took out her phone to snap some trip photos. Not wanting to risk being tracked, Dan quickly gathered everyone's cell phones and tossed them under a bridge, explaining he wanted a tech-free holiday for everyone's safety. At an American Automobile Association office, Dan stopped to pick up a map for the trip. The staff there was hesitant to give him the map since Dan didn't want to use a credit card. But with a little cash as an extra incentive, the staff member eventually handed over the map. As they continued driving, the atmosphere felt a bit strange at first without their usual gadgets to pass the time. However, they soon found other ways to enjoy the trip, breaking into laughter and singing together, bringing a new kind of fun to their family journey. Back at Dan's house, a man named McCaffrey and his 3 helpers were busy searching for any trace of Dan's family. They combed through records but couldn't find any recent credit card charges or social media posts that might reveal where they were. Frustrated, McCaffrey ordered his men to keep looking and grew suspicious, thinking Dan hadn't told them the whole truth about who he really was. Meanwhile, Dan and his family checked into a hotel, but he quickly changed his mind. He saw Kyle, a popular figure, snapping a photo with a fan and posting it online. Dan realized that staying there could put them in danger. He decided to keep moving, and his wife and kids had to sleep in the car for the night. Before long, 3 of McCaffrey's men showed up, riding motorcycles, and started chasing Dan's car. Dan tried to keep his family calm by turning up the music, hoping they wouldn't notice the trouble brewing. His baby son, Max, stayed wide awake, giggling as if he sensed his dad could handle the danger. Suddenly, one of McCaffrey's men pulled out a gun and aimed at Dan. Without hesitation, Dan shot back, hitting the man and knocking him off balance. Another criminal got close enough to grab onto the car, but Dan acted quickly, shoving Max's milk bottle into the man's helmet, causing him to lose his grip and tumble onto the road. With one criminal left, Dan made a bold move, swerving his car into the last man's motorcycle, sending him crashing into a billboard. The loud noise jolted Jessica awake, and she asked what happened. Dan, wanting to keep her calm, simply told her they had hit a pothole. After driving all night, Dan finally pulled over at a quiet plantation to rest. Just as he started to drift off, his daughter Nina woke up and noticed they were in Iowa. She asked him to take her to Southern Iowa University, the school she dreamed of attending. An argument broke out between Nina and her mom, Jessica, but Dan finally agreed, promising to take her to visit the campus. While strolling through the campus park, Kyle walked alongside Nina and Max. He brought up how their family didn't seem to approve of her dating Trevor, saying it was because Trevor had changed. Kyle added that he missed the old Nina, the one who was kind and close with the family. Hearing her younger brother's words, Nina's face lit up and she smiled, thanking him for caring more than she had expected. Nearby, Dan was listening to Jessica as she shared stories about her past as a pole vaulter and how a leg injury had forced her to let go of her athletic dreams. Dan wanted to open up about his own past, but his attention shifted when he spotted a man with a suitcase who looked suspicious. Curiosity got the better of him, so he approached the man, who explained he was a corn seed businessman from Germany looking for his daughter on campus. As they walked by a laboratory, Dan couldn't shake his doubts about the man's story. To test him, Dan started speaking in German, trying to see if he might be one of McCaffrey's men in disguise. Jessica looked at Dan in surprise, amazed to discover he could speak German. She left the hallway, giving Dan space to investigate. After the man opened his suitcase, revealing it was indeed filled with corn seeds, Dan finally believed him. But just then, one of McCaffrey's men appeared and fired a shot at Dan. Thinking quickly, Dan darted into the laboratory, where a fight broke out. Despite the struggle, Dan managed to overpower McCaffrey's man. Meanwhile, Nina was exploring the dorms at school and accidentally wandered into Trevor's room. To her shock, she found him there with another girl. Realizing her boyfriend was cheating, Nina decided to teach Trevor a lesson he wouldn't forget and ended things with him. A while later, Nina joined Dan and the rest of the family on their road trip to Las Vegas. When they reached Colorado, Nina offered to take over the driving from her dad. As they drove, she apologized to Dan for leaving behind her school magazine and promised she'd work hard to get her position back as the editor. She also thanked him for not mentioning any of it to Jessica. The next morning, after a night's rest in Colorado, Dan got in touch with Augie and made plans to meet him in Las Vegas to collect the family's passports. While waiting at a restaurant, Dan thought about telling Jessica his hidden past, but Kyle interrupted to talk to him. Kyle shared how he loved online gaming because it gave him confidence he didn't feel in the real world. Playing as Killboy made him happy, especially since so many people admired his skills online. Kyle also tried to persuade Dan that gaming was more than just a pastime. It required quick thinking and fast reflexes. He challenged Dan to a laser shooting game with a bet. If Kyle won, Dan would have to let him keep gaming, but if he lost, he'd quit gaming altogether. Dan accepted, and they went to the laser shooting game area. Kyle had no idea that his dad was skilled with weapons, so Dan won the game without much effort. Kyle felt downhearted, but Dan pulled him into a hug, trying to lift his spirits. When they arrived in Las Vegas, Dan and his family settled into their hotel room. Dan met Augie at the bar to pick up their new passports and flight tickets to Vancouver. Afterward, he returned to the room and got ready for dinner with Jessica, secretly making sure he had a few weapons with him, just in case. Before he left, he reminded the kids to stay in the room and not open the door for anyone. But soon after he left, Kyle, Nina, and Max couldn't resist the excitement. They snuck out to explore the hotel's online gaming area. Meanwhile, one of McCaffrey's men spotted Dan and his family in Las Vegas and quickly reported it to McCaffrey. Over in the gaming area, Kyle met a well-known gamer named Run, who invited him to meet some of the other players. At a nearby restaurant, Dan was trying to open up to Jessica about his past. But when the waiter spoke in French, Dan responded in French as well, accidentally sharing parts of his story out loud. Jessica, not understanding, thought Dan was just impressive for knowing another language and complimented him anyway. Back at the gaming area, Kyle was getting ready to join an online game after Ren asked him to fill in for him. Ren had his eye on Nina and wanted a chance to talk to her. Neither of them knew that McCaffrey's men were lurking nearby, watching their every move. After dinner, Dan and Jessica returned to their hotel room, unaware that their children were missing. Just as they entered, a group of McCaffrey's men stormed the room, aiming to hurt Dan. Relying on his quick reflexes, Dan managed to take down two of the attackers. But he stopped when Coogan, one of McCaffrey's henchmen, grabbed Jessica and held her at gunpoint. Seizing a brief moment, Dan threw a knife, hitting Coogan in the eye and freeing Jessica. Jessica, shaken, rushed to check on their children and found that Nina, Kyle, and Max were missing. Angry and worried, she hurried out, scolding Dan for keeping secrets from her and even saying she didn't want to see him again. Meanwhile, Kyle finished his online game and was thrilled to be named MVP. Not long after, Jessica and Dan found their way to the gaming area, relieved to see Kyle and the others safe and sound. In a quiet, safe spot, Dan finally opened up about his past. He revealed that he used to be a secret assassin who had escaped his dangerous life to start fresh as an ordinary citizen. Ever since then, McCaffrey and his men had been chasing him, wanting to get rid of him for leaving. When Kyle and Nina heard this, they couldn't believe it and started laughing, until gunshots suddenly rang out, cutting their laughter short. Dan acted fast, guiding his family to take cover in a nearby casino. He tried to fight off McCaffrey's men, but his shots were useless against their bulletproof vests. Undeterred, Dan kept working to distract them, finally managing to defeat them. After the dust settled, Dan made another confession. His real name was actually Sam. He explained that he'd once been in the military before McCaffrey recruited him for a special mission to take down criminals who seemed untouchable by the law. However, Sam soon realized that McCaffrey was using him to kill people in exchange for huge amounts of money. Disgusted by this, he escaped and left that life behind. Since then, McCaffrey had been on a relentless mission to hunt him down. To keep his family safe, Sam had gotten them all new passports and identities. But hearing all this, Kyle and Nina grew angry, feeling that Sam's decisions had ruined their lives. Jessica, hurt and shocked, felt deeply betrayed, realizing that her husband of 18 years was someone she didn't truly know. Out of frustration, she called her friend Gwen and asked her to arrange a getaway from Las Vegas. When Jessica and the kids met Gwen, They were surprised to see she had arranged a private jet for them. Once on board, Gwen started talking about an ex-boyfriend who lived in Buffalo and had married someone else. This story made Jessica suspicious, as she began to wonder if Gwen's ex was actually Sam. Upon arriving at their destination, Jessica planned to leave with her children, but they were suddenly confronted by McCaffrey. It turned out that Gwen had betrayed Sam's family, setting a trap to hand them over to McCaffrey in exchange for a chance to be with Sam again. McCaffrey took Jessica and the children hostage, using them to force Sam into meeting him alone at a casino. Shortly after, McCaffrey called Sam, threatening to hurt his family if Sam didn't do exactly as he was told. When Dan arrived at the casino, McCaffrey's men were using a drone to track his movements closely. Inside, Dan was greeted by a man named Spiros, who led him to the room where McCaffrey was holding his family hostage. Once Dan entered, McCaffrey greeted him, and during their tense conversation, he revealed a surprising truth. McCaffrey was actually Dan's biological father. He admitted feeling disappointed that Dan had abandoned him years ago to start a new life. McCaffrey then asked Dan to return as his top assassin, but Dan firmly refused. Frustrated, McCaffrey signaled Gwen to shoot Jessica. Terrified for his family's safety, Dan agreed to follow his father's orders, but only if McCaffrey promised to send Jessica and the kids safely back to Buffalo. McCaffrey accepted the deal, and Spiros began to escort Jessica and the children out of the room. Once they were in the elevator, Jessica came up with a clever plan. She used Max's diaper to distract Spiros and managed to push him off the top floor. Then, she quickly led her kids back to help Dan. Meanwhile, back in the room, Dan overpowered Gwen, giving his family the chance to escape. Realizing something was off, McCaffrey instructed his men to prepare for trouble. Dan told Jessica and the kids to head to the roof, where they handed the drone controls over to Kyle, who could help track McCaffrey's men from above. McCaffrey's men, who were waiting outside the elevator to capture Dan and his family, only found Max's equipment bag. When they opened it, a hidden bomb exploded, catching them by surprise. With Kyle guiding him using the drone, Dan started taking down McCaffrey's men one by one. During this, Gwen regained consciousness, and McCaffrey called her, ordering her to find Kyle, who was controlling the drone. Back in the casino, Dan aimed his gun at McCaffrey from an upper floor, demanding his father put an end to everything. But McCaffrey refused and ordered his men to fire at Dan, forcing Dan to dodge the bullets as they ricocheted around him. Meanwhile, on the building's roof, Jessica told her children to hide as she bravely confronted Gwen, who had tracked them down. Downstairs, Dan was struggling to anticipate his enemy's moves after McCaffrey shot down the drone that Kyle was using to help him. Back on the roof, Gwen was gaining the upper hand against Jessica and had plans to harm Kyle and the others. Determined to protect her family, Jessica climbed toward the top floor using a bamboo pole, but it snapped and Gwen laughed mockingly. Acting fast, Jessica grabbed a broken piece of bamboo and hurled it at Gwen, unintentionally causing her to fall to her death. Back inside, Dan faced off against McCaffrey in a tense showdown. Just as McCaffrey was about to fire, Nina arrived with the others and, calling McCaffrey grandfather, pleaded with him to stop. The surprise distracted McCaffrey, giving Dan the chance he needed to knock him down until McCaffrey finally lost consciousness. Nina had done this intentionally to give Dan a crucial moment to act. In the end, McCaffrey was arrested and sentenced for his many crimes. Nina went on to fulfill her dream of becoming a news reporter, while Dan started a security advisory company that provided services to banks. Jessica, too, achieved her goal, becoming an athletic coach at a local school. In their free time, the family enjoyed going on road trips together with a special rule: no cell phones allowed. They all savored the moments they spent together, sharing laughter and making new memories along the way. The film ends. So the moral of the story is, if your dad used to be an assassin, expect every family vacation to come with high-speed chases, secret identities, and a strict no-phones policy for safety reasons.